Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Another day, another round of tariffs from the U.S. This time, the target is steel and aluminum products from Canada and all other countries, which are now subject to a 25% import tax. For a while there, it looked like things were going to get a lot worse when on Tuesday, President Donald Trump said he would double the tariff amount for Canada in reaction to Ontario placing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the States. In the end, Ontario suspended the surcharge and the White House backed down from its more extreme position. Nonetheless, the original tariff plan has gone through, and the federal government has responded with countermeasures.
25% reciprocal tariffs on an additional $29.8 billion of imports from the United States.
Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc says this will apply to American steel and aluminum and other goods like computers, sports equipment, and cast iron products. And this is in addition to the first wave of retaliation that's already worth $30 billion. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. We'll speak about the impact of the U.S. tariffs on the industry and our economy, her thoughts on the counter tariffs from Canada, and what more the federal government can do to support impacted businesses and workers. Catherine, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Catherine, we went from facing 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum back to Plan A, 25% tariffs on those products from all countries. After all that chaos, how are you feeling?
Well, listen, the most important takeaway I was feeling last night was I hope people don't feel relieved that it's only 25%. Because, speaking frankly, 25% will be very difficult for the industry. So while 50%, completely would have shut the market access to the United States, 25% will still do a significant amount of damage.
Okay, so give our listeners an idea, first of all, of the size of the steel and aluminum industry in Canada, how many people it employs, how much business it does, and then the impact that these tariffs will have on those businesses and jobs.
So we have about 123,000 direct and indirect employees across the country. Our footprint is from Alberta to Quebec, so in terms of production. And then, of course, there's many users or downstream players of steel that go right across the country. So all of those folks and our producers will be impacted. We're about $15 billion contribution to GDP. And we have about $20 billion of trade between the United States and Canada back and forth on steel trade. And I think that's important to explain to users as well. To listeners, we have 6 to 7 million tons of steel that heads to the United States, and they send back to us 4 to 5 million tons. So there's a significant volume of steel that moves on both sides of the border. And both markets are important to the respective industries from the other countries. So, that's kind of what's at stake is this. And as I've mentioned many times to audiences and stakeholders, honestly, these tariffs we learned in 2018 impact both sides of the border. This is not just going to be contained to a Canadian impact. All of that integration I'm describing will mean that there is consequences economically on both sides.
And what are the Canadian exports like? How much does the U.S. rely on our steel?
From a steel perspective, we send just, between 6 and 7 million tons of steel to them a year. And that represents that we are the largest importer into the United States, and that represents about 23% of all of their imports into the United States. So without us, I think it's safe to say they'll have a significant gap to fill. And that's certainly a question we have is where they're not going to create new steel capacity in 5 minutes. These are very large operations. And how are they intending to do this and meet the demand of the United States economy? That's where that rub kicks in about economic impacts because people won't be able to find it. Prices are already soaring and will go higher because demand will be, there, but supply will be tight. So anyway, those are the types of things that will continue, probably accelerate in the days ahead.
How fast will we start to notice the impacts of this? How quickly will businesses have to scale back operations, maybe lay off workers? What are we looking at here? Days, weeks, months?
Well, sadly, just the threat of the tariffs already started to have an impact. So over the course of the last couple of months, particularly since about January, we've seen order books slow down. We've seen production curtailments. The last little while, we've seen at least two members publicly outline the layoff plans facing their industry. We know there are more, and we know there are more coming. Where it goes from here, I'd like to point out, is a bit of an unknown, and that's because we continue to call for the Canadian government to do some things to really give us a helping hand. And how far the bleed goes in terms of the industry, how devastating this is in Canada overall, will depend on how much action the government chooses to take. And that's a bit of an unknown at the moment, but we're certainly mapping out and have made proposals to the federal government on things that they could be doing right now in this context, even in this political climate, to help.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about all that in just a moment. But before we get off the impact aspect of all of this, if the U.S. did go to 50%, let's say, how much worse would that be?
Yeah, so, 25 is extremely difficult. 50% essentially shuts that market for us completely. So we won't be able to sell any steel, like at least at 25%. Some companies may have arrangements with customers to meet halfway in the middle, like depending on how high end their product is, they may be able to still ship. So it'll be reduced, but there'll still be shipments. At 50%, from the feedback I had from the industry yesterday when this came up as an idea or as a proposal or as a threat, that it's devastating and would have shuttered that market immediately.
And I guess I'm asking that because we're still in line for reciprocal tariffs, whatever that amounts to. We're not clear on yet from the U.S. And so that could be hitting in April. Are you fearful that steel and aluminum could be hit again with those reciprocal tariffs?
Absolutely. There's several other tariffs. There's also the possible return of the IEEPA tariffs. So that was 25%. Reciprocal tariffs, we're hearing something like 10%. I don't know where that number is going to be. You start adding all this up, and it does mean there is no certainty at all into the future. And that's why we think the time is now for the Canadian action. And I'm sorry, I know you want to talk about that later, but we really want to stress the urgency in taking some control back on our own agenda as a country, addressing some things that maybe we didn't feel we needed to address because we had easy market access to the United States. That needs to stop, like yesterday.
And we'll have more on the big story with Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, and a chat about that federal response in just a moment. Let's start with the federal counter tariffs that were announced, $29.8 billion worth of counter tariffs. I know previously when these tariffs were first threatened by President Trump, a number of organizations, including yours, I believe, had said they had to make sure that steel and aluminum from the U.S. was included in that. That is the case with these counter tariffs. Are you satisfied with these counter tariffs? They are dollar for dollar. Is it enough in your eyes?
Yes, so we in fact didn't want escalation. So we wanted truly the retaliatory tariffs to meet the U.S., so that we kept the playing field level between the countries, particularly as we hope someday we'll be back to dialogue about, CUSMA or USMCA renewal. So it was really important to us that we leveled the playing field right away. And that was done, and we really appreciate that. And beyond that, we were also really happy that we didn't escalate further and we saw, this new administration in the United States is ready to do things on a moment's notice if they feel threatened or they feel unhappy with the actions of a country. So I think Canada, did the right thing for our country this morning, by standing up firmly for us, but not over over emphasizing the problem by escalation.
They've also announced plans to help businesses and workers. One aspect on the business side of things is $5 billion of a trade impact program. And for workers, there's this employment insurance work-share program that basically puts federal funds forward so that businesses don't lay those workers off, that they can keep them on the payroll. It was something that was accessed during the pandemic. Is that enough to help businesses and workers weather this storm?
Well, I certainly think it's a good start. Some of our members will likely be able to leverage, for example, the EI Workshare program. But as the threat continues and as the impacts continue to build, we are worried that more might need to be done. We also understand more that might need to be done may require a parliament. So we don't have that in place at the moment. So we remain somewhat hopeful that as the devastation really starts to kick in, the government will review the question of the support mechanisms and how far they have to go. I think it's very fluid.
Yeah, and I guess the other question out of all of this is we could be heading to an election campaign soon, which would give more political certainty moving forward, but it still leaves possibly another month and a half or so before we get that political certainty, whatever the outcome of the election is. Can you wait that long, or is it going to be a lot more pain in that short amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why we made clear that we're making so clear now and keep coming back to this point of what can be done. And we took care and consideration of the types of things we asked for government so that it didn't require Parliament to be sitting and could be done by cabinet, by a minister, and even in caretaker mode if absolutely necessary. So that doesn't apply to the question of supports, but it does apply to the question of the things we really need. Like, we don't want supports forever. We actually want to move into a, long-standing, stable business environment. So our hope is that the government will heed our call to address unfair trade in our borders. We don't practice that when we make shipments to the United States. So we don't suffer from that, if you will. 95% of what we send to them is USMCA melted. But in our own borders, within our own control, we have a lot of unfair trade. Something like 40% of Canada's market is served by offshore imports, and many of them have cases against them adjudicated, if you will, by the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. So it's not us telling you this, it's the actual trade tribunal that has adjudicated this and determined that.
So you want to try and block off more steel and aluminum imports into our country so that more business is done for the Canadian sector. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, more unfair trade steel. That's the thing. We're happy to have competition. That's right. This is dumping cases, countervailing duty cases that show that these countries practice unfair trade. So we need to get them out of the market, keep everyone else in. We're happy to compete, but there's a significant amount of this unfair trade. Let's get rid of it. Time to.
More longer term, there's been a lot of conversations since this U.S. tariff threat began about nation-building projects like energy pipelines from east to west, high-speed rail from Quebec to Toronto. How much would those major projects help fill the gap if the U.S. is no longer a major customer for Canadian steel and aluminum?
The major projects, but there's also the ongoing projects. And frankly, it has been a great disappointment to the Canadian steel industry to see many projects, supported even by governments, to go to offshore imports. So we do feel that this is another opportunity. We were hearing from mayors, we're hearing from provincial leaders and federal officials all the time. What can we do better? What can we do differently? And, if you want to show your support for the domestic steel industry, let's start prioritizing Canadian steel in every project that is funded by taxpayer dollars. This is doable. This is, again, already practiced in other jurisdictions. I think the time has come to ask this question of why aren't we doing this here at home?
There's been talk since December. I interviewed the industry minister, Francois-Philippe Champagne, when he said that he'd be open to renegotiating the USMCA, CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, our North American Free Trade Deal. How much are you pushing for reopening that trade deal rather than waiting till 2026 when they launch that review? Would that help, do you think, bring some more certainty around all of this and for your industry?
Well, obviously, the ultimate objective, we would love to be back in a free and fair trading environment like the USMCA. It was good for, by the way, it was very good for the steel industry across North America, not just the Canadian industry, but also the US. So that would be an outcome. That would be, something we would celebrate. But it would require a few conditions. Like we could not have tariffication on our countries. This would have to end, and we'd have to have a lot more certainty in how things would continue to work between our nations. Overall, is this an agreement that is just, on every time you turn around, there's a new idea and it's torn up. So those are, I think, at this moment are going to be some barriers to entry. But again, it's why I'm happy to see dialogue happening between the governments to see what is the art of the possible. We may not know the answers to this yet. We may not, so we need to have those discussions.
Catherine, thank you so much for your time today and for trying to navigate through all of this.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the chance to talk to you.
And that was Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, speaking with me about the 25% tariffs the U.S. has placed on our steel and aluminum, the impact it's going to have on our industry, and what more the sector needs from the federal government. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can also find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.